The moment she met him, everything felt different. His laughter was the kind that filled the room, warm and golden, and his words flowed like honey. He had a confidence about him that made people pause, made her pause. In the early days, she couldn't quite put her finger on it. It was that magnetic pull, that irresistible draw. He was the kind of man who knew exactly how to make a woman feel like she was the only one in the world. For her, it was intoxicating, like standing at the edge of a cliff with the sun setting just beyond. His compliments were effortless, as if he'd been practicing them his whole life. "You're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen," he told her on their first date, his eyes sparkling like he had seen into her soul. And maybe for a moment she believed he had. There was something about his intensity, the way he listened, how he seemed to read her every thought, that made her heart flutter. She couldn't help but think, this is it, this is what love is supposed to feel like. But there was something else too, something she couldn't quite name. The way he would sometimes turn the conversation back to himself, how every story he told had a heroic twist, how he always seemed to be the star of every tale. She brushed it off as charisma, as charm. He was a man who knew his worth, she reasoned, a man who wasn't afraid to take up space. In those early days, the world seemed to glow in his presence. He had a way of making the mundane feel electric. Grocery shopping became an adventure. Late-night talks felt like whispered secrets, shared beneath the stars. He made promises too, ones that felt like they were written in the stars. "I'll always protect you," he said. "I'll never let anyone hurt you." She wanted to believe him. She did believe him. Slowly, though, things began to shift. It was in the smallest of ways, a sideways glance when she laughed too loudly, a raised eyebrow when she wore something he didn't like. At first, she thought she was imagining it. He was so perfect, so attentive, surely she was reading too much into it. But the small things became bigger. She noticed how he would test her reactions, pushing her just enough to see how far she'd bend. He'd tease her in public, little jabs disguised as jokes. "Don't be so sensitive," he'd say when she tried to explain how his words stung. "I'm just joking, you're too serious." She told herself it was harmless. Maybe she was too serious. After all, he was just being playful. That's what she wanted to believe. He had a way of turning every argument into her fault. Whenever she raised a concern, he twisted it back around until she was the one apologizing. "I'm just trying to help you," he'd insist, his voice calm and measured. "Why are you always so defensive?" And she'd find herself wondering, why am I always so defensive? She began to doubt herself, to question her own thoughts. It was like he was rewriting the story in real time, and she was just a character in his script. He was a master of the apology. When he crossed a line, he'd come back with flowers and sweet words, with promises that things would be different. He'd look into her eyes with that same intensity that had first drawn her in, and for a moment, she'd forget the hurt. "I love you more than anything," he'd whisper. "I can't lose you." And she'd hold on to those words like a lifeline. The good moments were so good, it made it hard to see the bad. He'd sweep her off her feet with grand gestures, with surprise dates and stolen kisses. He knew how to make her feel special, how to make her believe that no one else could ever love her like he did. But always in the quiet moments, there was that flicker of doubt, a little voice that whispered, "Something isn't right." He didn't like it when she spent time with her friends. "They don't really care about you," he said once, his tone laced with concern. "I'm the only one who really knows you." She started to believe him. She found herself cancelling plans, staying in with him instead. He said it was because he loved her so much, because he couldn't bear to be apart from her. And she wanted so badly to believe that kind of love was real. Slowly, her world began to shrink. The vibrant parts of her life, her friends, her hobbies, her laughter, dimmed in his shadow. She found herself walking on eggshells, measuring her words, trying to avoid that cold, disappointed look in his eyes. He didn't have to raise his voice. He didn't have to call her names. His disapproval was enough to keep her in line. And still, she clung to the good days, the sweet words, the tender moments that felt like they belonged in a movie. She told herself it was worth it, that every relationship had its ups and downs. She didn't want to be the girl who gave up too soon, who couldn't make it work. She'd invested so much of herself into him, she didn't know how to walk away. There were nights when she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation in her mind. She thought maybe if she could just be better, more patient, more understanding, things would get easier. He told her she was the problem, and she believed him. She stopped trusting her own voice, her own instincts. He was the red flag man, the one who wore his charm like armor, who knew exactly how to pull someone in and make them feel seen. The one who could make a woman question her own reality, who could rewrite every story until it fit his narrative. He didn't have to use his fists to break her down. His words were enough. He had a way of making her feel like she was the problem, like she was too emotional, too needy, too much. He'd call her crazy when she tried to explain how she felt, and in the quiet moments, she wondered if maybe he was right. Maybe she was crazy. Maybe she didn't know how to be loved. It took her a long time to see the truth, to understand that love isn't supposed to feel like a battlefield, that someone who loves you doesn't make you feel small, doesn't make you doubt yourself at every turn. She began to see the patterns, the way he'd isolate her from the people who cared about her, the way he'd build her up just to tear her down. She started talking to her friends again, reaching out in small tentative ways. She told them things she'd never dared to say out loud, and their reactions were like a splash of cold water. "That's not normal," they said. "That's not love." She didn't want to believe them at first. She wanted to protect the image she'd built of him, of them. But the more she talked, the more she realized how far she'd fallen. She found her voice again, slowly and shakily. She started to set boundaries, little ones at first. "No, I don't want to cancel my plans. Yes, I'm going to see my friends." Each time she stood her ground, he'd look at her with that familiar mix of disbelief and anger. He didn't like the change. He didn't like losing control. There were nights when he'd come back with that same old charm, trying to win her over again. "You're all I want," he'd say, his voice soft and pleading. And for a moment, she'd almost believe him. But she'd learned to see through the sweetness, to recognize the patterns. Love doesn't come with conditions. Love doesn't demand you shrink to fit someone else's mold. She realized she didn't need his approval to be whole. She didn't need his permission to be happy. She was tired of walking on eggshells, of living in a world where every day was a test of how much she could endure. She wanted more than that. She deserved more. Leaving wasn't easy. There were tears. There was fear. He didn't make it easy. Of course he didn't. He promised to change, to be better. He said all the right things, like he always did. But she'd learned the difference between words and actions. She'd learned that a man who loves you doesn't try to control you, doesn't make you doubt your own worth. She walked away, and for the first time in a long time, she felt the weight lift off her shoulders. She felt like she could breathe again, like the world was a little brighter. She reconnected with the parts of herself she'd lost, the laughter and the light, the dreams she'd set aside. She learned to trust her own voice again, to believe in her own strength. The red flag man taught her a lot, though not in the way he might have hoped. He taught her to pay attention to the subtle signs, the little ways someone chips away at your confidence, the small ways they make you feel like you're not enough. He taught her that love isn't about control or manipulation. It's about respect, about kindness, about lifting each other up. She learned that sometimes the most dangerous men don't come with fists raised, but with smiles and sweet words. They come as the man who says, "I'll protect you," while tearing you down behind closed doors. They come as the man who says, "You're mine," and means it like a cage. She promised herself she'd never ignore the signs again. She promised herself she'd never settle for a love that made her feel less than she was. She learned to trust the voice inside her that said, "You deserve more, you deserve better." The red flag man was a chapter in her story, but he wasn't the end. He was a lesson, a warning. And when she closed that chapter, she found a new beginning waiting for her. A life that was hers alone, no strings attached, no one else's shadow to live in. She found her own light, her own strength. And she knew finally that she didn't need anyone to tell her she was enough. She always had been.